Welcome to the Hammer Territory Podcast. My name is Shawn Coleman. Hope wherever you are and wherever you are listening, you had an excellent Thursday getting ready for a good weekend. And if you are a Braves fan, yes, it's unfortunate. 24 hours ago, the Braves season ended for the 2024 season. And yes, while I think that many, and I'll include myself in that, may have felt a bit sad this morning that the season was over. As always, my podcast partner Stephen Tolbert is with me. Stephen, I can say this: yes, a bit sad, a bit bittersweet, but I'm going to be honest with you. I think I've seen a few people say it. It was, and I think I saw you say it just a little bit ago on Twitter. It was time. It was just time for this season to be done. We had accomplished what felt like was going to be our ceiling this year, and while we may not have gone out in the most best of fashion, overall it seems like, hey, not too disappointed with how the season ended. It was the right time for it to end.
Yeah. What's up, Shawn? It was a frustrating end for sure. Not having your pitchers available for the postseason. The hurricane happened. Chris Sale got hurt. You had the bad game on Sunday against KC, which would have made your life a lot easier if you won. You had the doubleheader on with the Mets with a blown lead in the first game, and then the two games in San Diego were, the first one was. I don't think the first one was all that competitive. I think the second one was very uncompetitive. The Braves probably should have won the second one, but yeah, I'm. It's a weird feeling anytime the season ends because obviously what we do here and doing the podcast and writing for battery power, we're pretty heavily invested in this stuff, and so we spend a ton of time actually all season, in the spring training, all throughout the season, covering the team. And when it ends, there is a weird feeling, and it's a combination of sadness, but also in this case a bit of relief. Honestly, I mean, I'm sitting here watching the Mets and the Brewers play a playoff game, and I don't have any emotional attachment really to it, and it's just more enjoyable, quite honestly. I mean, watching the Braves this year became quite a chore, if I'm being honest. More of a chore than I remember in any season. And largely because of the offensive frustrations where it just felt like we watched the same game every night. And it just came down to whether or not the pitching could hold the other team to 3 runs or less. And if they could, then the Braves had a good chance of winning. If they couldn't, then the Braves had a really good chance of losing. And it just became a chore, quite honestly. And it's funny. I was thinking about this. I didn't fully understand how much the like really fun part of the team is tied to Ronald Acuna Jr. and Spencer Strider until this year. Like those two guys watching those two guys play baseball is some of the most fun I've ever had watching baseball. And when you take those guys out of the lineup, there's just the joy factor of watching the team goes down more than you would think with just two players out of 26. But yeah, it was just time. It was time for the season to end. The way they were playing, the Padres are just playing miles and miles better than them, and all teams are better than them. And you know, I was ready for the season to be done.
And I think that that's something that definitely is worth, diving a bit more into, is that it just, the fun of watching the Braves with the excitement of anticipating, oh, if we win this game, if we win the next game, what could that open up? What could the possibilities be there? You want to have that when you're in the playoffs, right? You want to think about this ceiling. You want to think about all the possibilities that are out there. And with each win, how much closer the ultimate prize is to being a reality. I remember back in 2021, it was so exciting to see how well we were playing, especially those first two games against the Dodgers. That really, to me, kind of opened up like this could really happen. But I never got that feeling with this team, right? I never truly had that feeling with this team because of the injuries that occurred and how frequently they occurred to our best players. How many games, time after time, we saw this team not only have bad luck in one game, but have a bad approach in the other. And what I'm getting at is that the injuries, the bad luck, the overall bad performance, it just piled up and piled up and piled up to where, to be honest with you, it was hard to watch this team with excitement and joy because you're constantly thinking, okay, what negative thing is going to happen next? How is a bout of, bad luck going to top what previously happened? I don't want to sit here and be too negative, but that's kind of the feeling that I had. And when I say that it felt like it was the right time for the season to end, I'm not saying the team felt like that. But that's kind of how I feel many in Braves country felt watching this team. And it's unfortunate that's the way that the season has to end. But it also really kind of sums up this team either met its ceiling with all it went through or even exceeded it. But at the end of the day, it just was not a fun product to watch. Not really anything because of the team had done in the negative sense, but just with all the stuff that they couldn't control piling up on them to get in their way of, reaching where they wanted to go.
Yeah, it's funny. I was watching, obviously we were all watching the playoff games, and I was just watching like how much energy and excitement was in that crowd in San Diego. And they have a really fun team to watch. And I was just thinking, even when the Braves were going well this year, I never really, you never really felt that level of like pure like excitement the way, San Diego, they were just having a blast in that stadium in the last couple of games. And, it didn't feel that way for the Braves this year. And 100%, I mean, it's definitely most contributed to the injuries, right? Not having your best player, arguably your two best, arguably your three best players. When you talk about, Acuna, Strider, and Riley, Sale is probably in that category now. But yeah, it was a weird season. It was unlike any season I can remember because the Braves objectively did well, like to win 89 games with the talent that they had left on the team to make the playoffs. Like they had a positive run differential, a easily positive run differential. Like they were objectively a good team, but they were a very frustrating team to watch. And again, because so much of it was like the same game over and over, you knew if the other team scored more than 3 runs that the game was probably over. You just had to sit there and watch the offense flail away, for 9 more innings before it was confirmed. And, it was just a frustrating year to watch, quite honestly. And I do think some things need to change. I don't think, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but I don't think it's just the injuries that caused this season to happen. I that's what I don't want to. I don't want to hear that all off season that it was just like it was just the injuries. I do think there's some things that need to change, especially on the offensive side with the approach. The postseason stuff is getting concerning again, which we'll get into later. But the injuries are a huge part of it. But I do think there's some nuance there that I hope gets picked up throughout the offseason. And of course, we'll try to talk about it as much as we can. But yeah, it was just time for the season to end.
So, Stephen, Scott and Brad did, as they always do, did an excellent job breaking down game 2, and we won't go, in depth with it, like they did, because of course, they, gave their analysis of the game and in general, kind of where things stand now that the season has ended. But another perspective that I want to look at when it comes to the short, but I think it's somewhat significant in the case of a few players postseason that we just went through. I want to kind of take some performances from this playoff series and tie them to the season as a whole and what it means for that specific player moving forward. And the first that stands out to me is Max Fried. Me and you talked about it on Tuesday. We were highly confident going into game 2, maybe not highly, but somewhat confident going into game 2. At the very least, our confidence in the Braves potentially winning game 2 was Max Fried being on the mound. He had a whole lot of reasons to be motivated to do well. He had come off one of the best starts we've seen from him in recent memory. In his previous start for the Braves, it seemed like that he was in a good position to deliver. But unfortunately, and as we've seen before when it comes to him in the playoffs, some bad luck and then some bad spots with his pitches at the worst possible time got him. But in the second inning, 5 infield hits or 4 infield hits in a fielder's choice. That led to the double given up to Manny Machado, as well as the near home run triple that was given up to Jackson Merrill. Max Fried definitely didn't live up to, what you expect from him last night. But it was also another postseason start, Stephen, where we saw some weird stuff going on. The infield hits, Max getting hit by the line drive from Fernando Tatis Jr. This is not the first time. Last year, the blister that he was dealing with. He tries to ramp up and he struggles. Overall, when you look at Max Fried in the playoffs, his numbers suggest that he has struggled in the postseason, and he has. But he also played a huge role in our World Series run. The point that I'm getting at is that when it comes to Max Fried, I know that some will point to his postseason struggles and be like, this is a reason why we probably really won't miss him in these big moments. But I also point to say that if you really dig deep into his postseason starts, there's been some weird scenarios. What are your thoughts with another start where Max Fried struggled, but in general, your thoughts about how he performed in the postseason as a Brave?
Listen, it's difficult because you are judged. A lot of players are judged on the postseason, and it's not fair because it's such a tiny sample of games, and anything can happen in this tiny sample of games. And you could play 1,000 games in the regular season, and you could play 20 games in your career in the postseason, and what you do in those 20 games is what people are going to remember you for. I am not like that. I don't think that I don't really care. I mean, I do care what guys do in the postseason relative to that season, but looking at their entire career, it doesn't affect how I think about them as much as it does other people. Max was a really good pitcher for the Braves. Um, I am going to talk about him more in the past tense because I do think he's probably done. I don't know of a single person that thinks he's coming back. And even when he talked, in the last few days, he talked like a guy that wasn't coming back and knew that he wasn't coming back. So, I think Max's career with the Braves has been unbelievable. He won a World Series in 21. He pitched the clinching game. He'll always have that. Braves fans will always have that. He did have some bad postseason games since then. So, that matters, and that's part of this conversation. And I am interested to see how it affects his free agency, how it affects his dollar amount that he gets. I don't think it'll affect it a ton, quite honestly. He's still going to get paid a lot of money, but yeah, Max did not have a good night, and he's had a couple of those throughout his career, and that matters. It does matter. And I understand why fans think that way. I understand why people are critical of him in the postseason, especially the last 3 years. He did have some unfortunate things happen in those games that are not entirely his fault. So yeah, it is what it is. He's probably done for the Braves, and um, I'm very appreciative of what he did in his time in Atlanta. And I don't want all the good to just be undone because it didn't end great. I think people, hopefully, as time passes and we get a little further away from his time with Atlanta, people appreciate him a little more than they're probably going to in the next couple of years.
And I'll elaborate on this as we go into the postseason, but I have no trouble saying this as of right now because I truly do believe it. I think the top five pitchers in Braves franchise history, in terms of, at least, the past 100 years or whatever, I think the top five pitchers in Braves franchise history are Maddox, Smoltz, Glavine, Necro, as well as Spawn. I think that many would agree with that statement. But if you wanted to make the case for Max potentially being, the sixth or seventh person on that list, especially with that World Series title, I think that you can make that claim. Again, that may be a bit of a hot take. We can elaborate on that at a later date, but that's my opinion of Max Fried. He's been incredible more often than not as a Brave, and when we needed him the most to reach a level that we had tried so hard to reach for a quarter century, he stepped up and delivered and helped us get that 21 World Series title. So I agree. I think that he has pitched his last game with the Braves. I do wish him the best of luck. Again, we'll talk about him plenty as the offseason goes along, but I definitely think that the overall opinion of Max Fried should be that he was one of the best arms in Braves franchise history. But speaking of players who very much are a part of our present and our future, another play, kind of shifting gears here a little bit, a player that really stood out, not only in September, really helping this Braves lineup at times look like what it could be when it's going good, and someone that finally had a good postseason was Michael Harris II. If you go back to 2022, the way he ended his rookie year to win, or his rookie year to win Rookie of the Year over Spencer Strider, he was incredible. But in that 22 playoffs, he was irrelevant. He was very bad in the 22 playoffs, struggled through 2023, struggled again in the 23 playoffs, struggled for much of this year. But Steven, I don't know if he could have ended his season in a better way. At the top of the order, in a very, very critical spot, in the leadoff spot, he delivered time and time again and also stepped up in big moments in the playoffs. If this could be him stepping up to be a big time player in big moments, that could be a huge, huge boost to our offense gaining more consistency once again in 2025 and beyond. It was really good to see him deliver in big moments, both in the regular and postseason to end this year.
Yeah, it was. I mean, he had those two awful postseasons against the Phillies. Again, I don't put a ton of value in postseason performance relative to talent level. It's just so random. More importantly to me was the month of September that he had, quite honestly. You know, he has so much talent. I mean, you and I talked about this at the beginning of the year, like how much talent this guy has and how unbelievable he can be if he can reach that potential. I still have concerns about his plate discipline numbers. They're still pretty scary. But he did do a lot better in September and in the obviously in the series against San Diego with taking bad pitches and swinging at good pitches. And if Michael Harris takes bad pitches and he swings at good pitches, he can be he can win an MVP one day. Like that's how talented this kid is, and that's how critical that one skill is in terms of developing for him. Where if he doesn't allow pitchers to get him out with sliders in the dirt and changeups in the dirt, and he forces pitchers to throw pitches over the plate to get him out, he will be awesome and he's got all the talent in the world. He's got a beautiful left-handed swing. His left-handed swing, of course, is critical for the Braves because they don't have a lot of left-handers. It's basically him and Olsen these days, and when he's going well, the offense is very different, and he's got all the talent in the world. And I was really happy for him to have the September that he had, to have the postseason he had, to get that monkey off his back. I'm sure he got sick of hearing people talk about his two terrible postseasons. And I'm very to see what happens in 2025. I think he can be. I mean, honestly, we don't know what version of Acuna we're going to get after, two torn ACLs. It's very possible that Michael Harris is now the Braves' most dynamic player. And, he could really come into his own. He's about to enter what is probably the prime of his career. You know, the sky's the limit for this kid. If he can lay off the junk in the dirt, swing at good pitches, and let that talent show through, the sky is the limit for him.
And of course, another player who stood out in yesterday's game, and this has been a consistent theme of this player in a Braves uniform, was Jorge Soler. He hit the big home run, to make the score 5-2. He did everything that he needed to do in that first at bat in the top of the ninth inning, just hit it right to Jackson Merrill, 110, off the bat. And I don't know if many people remember, but on Monday he also had a couple of big hits as well. And Jorge Soler, I know that a lot's been talked about when it comes to how he performed in the field, and that there were several examples of why he should not be in the field for the Braves. But I also don't think enough's been brought up about just how good he was at the plate. A 360 on base percentage, 255 ISO, I believe a 860 OPS, 850 OPS, 138 WRC plus. Jorge Soler added value offensively. He was a good get at the trade deadline for this Braves team that needed to boost offensively. He provided that. So, Steve, what I'm getting at is I think Jorge Soler, and especially when it comes to trying to figure out what version of Ronald Acuna Jr. we're going to get coming off his injury, and we expect that we're going to pick up Marcell Ozuna's option for next year. I don't really want to get into what's going to happen for 2025, but what I will say is this: Jorge Soler, in my opinion, definitely brings value for the Braves moving forward. They need players who can provide good overall approaches at the plate, that can hit for power, that can get on base, and can deliver in the postseason. And it's hard to find many Braves who offer a better combination of that than Jorge Soler. He proved it once again this postseason.
Yeah, I mean, the Braves love Jorge Soler. I mean, regardless of how individual fans think of him, the Braves love him. They have said that they have tried to acquire him multiple times over the years. They've acquired him twice and tried multiple times outside of the two times they actually did. So they clearly love his bat, and he does have a good eye at the plate. He will take walks. He obviously has a ton of power. it just comes down to the fit at some point. I mean, they have Acuna in right. I don't think there's any chance he could play left field. He's just so big and slow. The left field in Truist Park is huge. Left field's actually harder to play in Truist than right field is. So I don't know what they're gonna. I really don't know what they're gonna do. I don't really know if you can have two DHs on the team. That really hamstrings you in terms of any other kind of versatility or mobility in your roster. So it'll be that's one of the keys of the offseason, of course, is what's going to happen with that situation. I'm fairly certain they're going to pick up Marcelo Zuna's option. Soler is under contract for 2 more years. You got Ronnie coming back, so that's a whole mess that's going to be sorted out. But just the player, you're right. I mean, his bat is very valuable to the Braves. Um, the only thing that would be better, honestly, is if he was left-handed versus right-handed. He is another right-handed bat in a right-handed heavy lineup, but the Braves needed more offense when they went and got him, and they were willing to sacrifice a ton of defense in right field to do it. So that's how much they think about his offense. And, he played pretty well for the Braves. I think he was, I think they were probably hoping for maybe one level more than they got from him in terms of the whole, 2 months he was with the team. But, I think he was pretty close to being what they hoped he would be, at least offensively. I think the defense was probably worse than they thought it would be. And that's going to play a factor into what they do this offseason. But yeah, the Braves do need, I mean, they need guys who can take walks. And I'm going to say that probably 1,000 times between now and, when the roster's done being built for the 2025 season, that the Braves need guys who can take walks. The Braves need guys who can stare at bad pitches and literally keep the bat on their shoulder because they just don't have enough of that in this lineup. And just too many times they have guys just wailing away at terrible pitches and get themselves out of rallies and help pitchers out. And they just need more guys. And Ronnie's a big part of that. Getting Ronnie back, Ronnie always runs like a 13-14% walk rate. He's an elite plate discipline guy in that manner. Riley's pretty good. But they need more players in the lineup that can take walks. And Soler can do that. So it is going to be very interesting what they do with him, obviously, over the next 3 months.
One other thing that I think that also needs to have a spotlight put on it from the past two games and even Monday. One thing that I feel like that I've been a bit critical of when it comes to the Braves is that they've not really we just saw the Padres their bullpen. I know that some of the pieces were traded for, but there are also some of their pieces that they have developed. The Padres seem like they have developed some pretty good relievers over the years. The Braves not so much in terms of developing their own relievers. AJ Minter, Dylan Lee, yes, they've done well when it comes to left-handers. But you go back to Tuesday night in game one of the wild card series, Aaron Bummer looked really good. And Steven, I don't know of anyone who has been a bigger source of support for Aaron Bummer than yourself, with the fact that it just seems like Brian Snitker hasn't trusted him all year long. Many have wanted Daysbel Hernandez to get, a really good look in the majors, and he looked good in game two. I know that our back end of our bullpen is pretty much set for next year, but I do think that there are going to be a few spots to fill. Grant Holmes has shown what he can do as a versatile option out of the pen. He may be Jesse Chavez replacement, but the point that I'm excited about is that when it comes to our bullpen, yeah, the back end of our bullpen may be spoken for next year, especially if Minter comes back, but we've got some depth now, and if there could be more trust put on Bummer as well as Hernandez and Holmes, for instance, maybe using them more in high leverage situations can ensure that our bullpen stays as fresh as possible for the postseason. It was really good to see some of our bullpen depth that we've developed in recent years really step up. I know we acquired Bummer, but really step up and deliver over the past couple of days.
Yeah, I am curious to see what Daysbel does next year. I'm very curious to see what role that Aaron Bummer has. The Braves have to pick up his arbitration number, and it's not going to be cheap. So, you know, with a guy like Bummer, it's tough to pay that amount of money if you're not going to use him on high leverage. And the Braves should use him in high leverage, but they absolutely did not use him in high leverage in 2024. So, um, Alex's decision on whether or not to keep him around at that number, and I don't have the number right in front of me. I know the arbitration numbers got released a couple of days ago, but I'm guessing it's around 8 or 9 million. Um, having a guy on your roster who makes that much money, who's not a high leverage reliever, is a tough place to be. So, they're probably going to have to talk to Snit about like, hey, this dude's really good. Maybe use him in bigger situations than just cleaning up other guys' messes, which is basically what he did all of 2024. And Daysbell still has to work on his command. But yeah, the back end of the bullpen, I mean, the whole bullpen all year was unbelievable. Honestly, I mean, it's funny, Shawn. I've read a lot of recaps of the season so far in the last 24 hours. Everybody's writing their like end of season recaps and talking about all the things that went wrong for the team. And I don't think enough has been made about all the things that went right in 2024, like all the good fortune the Braves had in 2024. Chris Sale being at the top of that list, being a Cy Young guy for the first time in like 6 years. Ronaldo Lopez turning into a starter from being a reliever the last 4 years and being unbelievable in that role. No one saw that coming. Spencer Schwellenbach coming out of nowhere. But also Rocio Iglesias and Joe Jimenez having the seasons they had where they were both top 10 relievers in baseball. And that was kind of out of nowhere. I mean, I thought those guys could be good, but like no one expected them to be that good. And that was a big part of the season. And it's not necessarily a part of the season you can guarantee that's going to happen again next year. Bullpens are just so volatile. So, I do think they need to lean on Aaron Bummer more. I am curious to see what they do around these guys. Pierce Johnson will be back. I think he signed a 2-year deal last offseason, so he'll be back. The bullpen's going to be interesting. It should be good. Alex usually builds a pretty good bullpen. So I have faith that it'll be good, but I'm guessing the names will be different. And I'm hoping they use Aaron Bummer a little more than they did in 2024.
Well, Stephen, when they acquired him, they definitely wanted to make sure they had him for multiple years. Looking up at the contract numbers, it actually is pretty decent. They have team options for him for the next 2 years at around seven and a quarter million for
Okay, so it's 7.25.
yeah, but it's not only for 2025, 2026 as well. I believe I looked that up correctly. So, but I agree. Especially if you're going to be without AJ Minter, you just got to trust him. You've got to trust him because he shows stuff that is very hard to hit at times. I know that he's had a bit of a history of hey, his actual numbers are much worse than his expected numbers, but at some point you got to trust him, and they did in game one, and I think that he showed his worth. But of course, the biggest thing of all that stands out, if we're going to take what occurred this postseason and we're going to broaden it out to say, okay, what does this mean for the near-term future as we look to shape up the offseason? Stephen, you said it yourself. You pointed this out. 10 games over the past 3 years, and we've scored 25 runs. And I'll honestly say this. I feel like that last night's offensive performance was arguably the best that we've seen. That may have been the best offensive game that the Braves have had in the postseason since they won the 2021 World Series. Maybe game 2 of the 23 playoffs. But they hit multiple homers. They put good contact on the ball multiple other times that just didn't work out. But me having to defend last night's game as being one of the best offensive games they've had over the past 3 postseasons, that is what sticks out to me as a struggle. I get small sample size, and I get that it's a crapshoot, but I do think that's something that certainly is there for a takeaway. And it's especially, I feel, more valid after we saw the same things pop up during the regular season this year that have consistently popped up in the postseason, is that you pointed it out. Approaches need to change when it comes to our offensive game plan, because if they don't and we're not hitting home runs, we are going to likely continue to struggle when we face quality pitching in the postseason. That's happened 3 straight postseasons in a row. Put whatever value you want in a 10-game sample size, but it is a bit concerning, and I think needs to be a bigger part of how we shape our offseason.
Yeah, I mean, that's how you get judged. Like, it's not fair, but that's how you get judged. And the truth of the matter is, the last 3 postseasons, the Braves have gotten not just beaten, but dominated in all 3 of these series they've played, 2 against the Phillies, and obviously this one against San Diego. They scored 25 runs total in those 10 games, 2.5 runs a game. maybe more concerning is, over those 10 games is 90 innings. And of the 90 innings they played in those three series, they only led in four of those innings. So that's how much they've been dominated in the last 3 years in postseason play. And listen, when you're a team that's trying to win a World Series, and this is the results you're putting up in the first round of your playoff series, multiple years in a row, the GM, the manager, like at some point, those guys start feeling the heat for that. Like that's just the nature of the beast. Like, is it terribly fair? No, because again, it's a 10 game sample in baseball. A 10 game sample is nothing, but these are the most important games of the year, and you can't just get dog walked the way the Braves have the last 3 years and continue that into the future and eventually feel the heat from it. And I thought Scott and Brad had a really good show last night. They did about a full hour about talking about the game and the season. And I thought they brought up a good point. Like if 2021 hadn't happened and, because the Braves got knocked out of the first round in 18, they got knocked out in the first round in 19. I don't count 2020. That was the COVID year. Playoff games were in neutral sites. There were no fans. I don't count 2020. If you take all the full seasons, which has been 6 full seasons, the Braves have been knocked out of the first round in 5 of them and won the World Series in the other. And if 2021 hadn't happened, the conversation about Alex and the Braves and Snit would be very different right now. If they had just continued this run of just getting just skull dragged in the first round of the playoffs, the murmurs would be quite a bit louder. But 2021 buys you some time. But I do think if we're at the same spot next year, like if we're having the same conversation next year, and again, I think Scott said this last night, if the 2025 postseason goes like 2022, 2023, and 2024 has gone, we're gonna have a different conversation about like Anthopoulos, Snitker. Like you can't just keep getting destroyed in the first round of the playoffs and not have it ever come back on you, as the people in charge of the franchise. So, the injuries are going to save them from a lot of that this offseason. Most people are just going to wrap it up in the injuries and kind of just, throw it out as is not much you can do about it. But if it happens again next year and it's 4 years in a row of this, the conversation is going to be very different.
And that's where I think acknowledgement in the present is important. I can't speak for anybody else, but I am a huge, huge believer in Alex Anthopoulos. If it's 12 months from now and we're having this same conversation, I'm still not going to be an advocate for parting ways with Alex Anthopoulos. I'm a huge believer in what he does and how he does it, and I feel that he is going to make the necessary changes because we've seen him do it time and time again. But I say that to say this when I talk about acknowledgement. Last year, in the next 48 hours, we're likely going to see Alex Anthopoulos' exit interview, end of the year statements, whatever you want to call it. Last year, at this time when he had that, he brought up a lot of logical points for the reasons why the Braves had gotten thoroughly beaten by the Phillies 2 straight years, but why there shouldn't be much change to the overall makeup of the team. Alex talked about how he trusted his core with how well they had played during the regular season, how you couldn't really put too much emphasis on a 4 game sample size, so on and so forth. And those points still exist as being logical a year later. Injuries definitely played a big part in the Braves' overall ceiling as well. But the big difference between what Alex Anthopoulos said then and what he said now, we've had a whole regular season of the same issues that plagued the Braves in the 22 and 23 playoffs. It got in their way from being where they truly wanted to be all season long. So it has become a bigger concern for this team. And I want to see that acknowledged. Like, I'm not going to sit here and, just completely change my opinion of Alex Anthopoulos if he mainly talks about injuries or small sample size or whatever when he's asked about, another year of playoff struggles. But I want to see, what he has to say about the fact that the writing is on the wall that the Braves' offensive approach, it definitely has room for improvement. And so that's what I'm really hoping to see Alex look at. And last year, he acknowledged that pitching needed to be improved. He went out, made the moves that he made in the offseason, and the results were better than anybody expected. Not necessarily saying that's going to happen for this offense. Also, don't think there's going to be a lot of changes, but in terms of the approach for this team, I think that needs to be a focus, and I hope that he acknowledges that in his comments in the next day or so.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've said it a bunch on the show. The injuries are probably the biggest factor in what happened this season, but they are certainly not the only factor. And I have gotten annoyed with people that have kind of whitewashed it under the headline of, well, they just had a bunch of injuries and just leave it at that. I think that's just an incomplete I think that's an incomplete view of what happened in 2024. The injuries are a big part of it, but the Braves offensive approach has been exposed a bit. And when you build the entire thing out of hitting home runs like they have, and Chipper talked a little bit about this in the podcast that he did, you got to hit so many homers. Like the Braves still were like top 5 at homers this year, but their offense wasn't nearly the same because they didn't have the on base percentage to go with it. So it was a lot of solo home runs. And even being top 5 in homers this year, they still hit like 100 or so less homers than they did last year, which is, of course, a ton of runs to remove from any lineup and still be as good. So the offensive approach is definitely something I want to hear him talk about. I want to hear what he has to say about that. Pitchers getting hurt right before the postseason. That's just, I mean, it's bad luck. Like, I don't know what can be done about that. Honestly, I mean, the Braves, I thought the Braves did about everything you could do in terms of resting guy. I mean, I thought the Braves went too far in resting guys in the regular season at times. Instead of banking wins early in the year, they punted a lot of games to try to get these guys to October. And in the end, they didn't get any of the dividends that they were hoping they would get and still punted games in April, May, and June. And I'm guessing if they had it to do over again, they would have probably banked a few more of those wins early in the season. And, knowing that they weren't going to get these guys healthy to October either way. But the offensive approach is something that has to improve. And some of that is talent. They got to get a real shortstop. They need, the Jared Kelnick thing really did not work this year. I'm very curious to see what they do in left field with him, if he's the starter again, or if they try to do something else. Because that did not go well. I mean, Ramon Laureano essentially just took his job from him in like June or July and never gave it back. And so I'm curious to see what they do there. I want them to get a little bit more left-handed help. I've said that multiple times, but the offensive approach is definitely the number one thing I'm curious to hear about when Alex talks, probably tomorrow or the next day, because I don't think that can just be swept under the rug as, well, we had injuries, because even when guys played, they were substantially worse than they normally are. And is Kevin Seitzer going to be back? Are they going to look to do things a little bit differently? I'm okay hearing mostly about the injuries. I'm not okay hearing entirely about the injuries. I do want some accountability for, I think they mismanaged the rotation a little bit early in the season by giving all these guys all that rest and not getting any of the dividends from it later on. And I do think they need to talk about the offensive approach and ways they maybe are going to look, to do that differently.
Yeah, and if you're going into the start of this offseason and you look at the Braves in the playoffs and you see, for instance, the fact that it seemed like so many times during the regular season and we saw it happen multiple times in the playoffs. We had Ramon Laureano and Gio Ursula up in big moments. And you think to yourself, well, listen, next year it's going to be Ronald Acuna Jr. and Alex Riley in for those guys, and you're going to have much better options in those big moments. Yeah, there's some truth to that. But it's also worth pointing out that Ronald Acuna Jr. was not playing anywhere near his MVP level to start this season. I don't mean that as I mean it as a stated fact. You can take it as criticism if you want, but I don't mean that as saying, that what Ronald Acuna Jr. did in 2023 was a fluke. I don't mean that at all. Austin Riley was striking out at a nearly 40% clip with runners in scoring position. He struggled mightily with runners in scoring position. So when we talk about the offensive approach changing, that doesn't mean multiple big trades where we trade guys who we extended for, nearly a decade 2 years ago, trading them off. It's just getting a different approach at the plate to be able to deliver in big moments. Because again, the Braves tied the record for most home runs hit in a season in 2023. That likely is not a sustainable rate of hitting home runs. And home runs are very important to hit in the postseason, but you also have to be a reliable hitting unit in situations. Your situational hitting has to be good if the home runs are not there, and that has clearly become a major flaw for this Braves team to get where they want to get. And I think, to me, and that's why I would like for Alex Anthopoulos to acknowledge it, I think that's the biggest takeaway from this season and should really be at the core of shaping the offseason approach. Steven, do you have anything to add as we wrap up this edition of the Hammer Territory podcast?
No, I mean, it was a good season. It was a frustrating season. But I do think it is important to keep perspective that there are plenty of franchises out there that would love for this to be, they would love 89 wins and a playoff berth to be their like hyper frustrating season. Right. So some of this is champagne problems, right? Where like the Braves are just always good, and you know, we do lose perspective as fans sometimes about how bad some other teams are. Like the Colorado Rockies would kill to have the season the Braves just had. And, for Braves fans, it feels like a pretty disappointing year. So it is important to keep perspective. And I said this the other night that 89 wins is not easy. Making the playoffs is not easy. Those things need to be celebrated. But, for the Braves, who have plainly stated that their goal is to win the World Series every year, to get demolished in the playoffs 3 straight years, to go home after the first series. They've won 2 out of their last 10 playoff games. They clearly have some areas of the team that need to be better. They clearly have some approach issues that need to get better. They're going to have to replace Max Fried. Almost certainly they're probably going to have to replace Charlie Morton. They got 2 DHs on the team currently. They don't have a shortstop on the team, in my opinion. This is a big offseason. Like there's a lot to do. Last year, the offseason, there wasn't a lot to do, quite honestly. I mean, they needed another pitcher. They got Chris Sale. They re-signed Joe Jimenez and Pierce Johnson, and they traded for Kelnick. That's pretty much all they really needed to do last year. That is not the case this year. There are some things to figure out. And, after the season they've had and some of the issues that have popped up that look like they're real issues, I'm very curious to see how Alex attacks this offseason and in a number of different areas. And it's going to be very interesting to see where they go and if they have any sort of organizational shift in the type of hitters they go after. I would love to see them speed on the team. I would love to see them get more left-handed on the team. I think they're too right-handed, and I think they're too slow. And I would love to see those areas improved. But we'll see. It's a long off season. We're going to have plenty of time to talk about it. We do appreciate all the downloads, all the listens, the comments, the rates, the reviews, all that has been terrific. And it was a fun season. It's a frustrating season, but it was still a fun season. And yeah, this podcast doesn't stop. It'll be here for all winter, and then we move into 2025.
And I'll be honest with you, Stephen, I'm really looking forward to over the next, few weeks, talking about some of the highlights this season, talking about just how special of a season Chris Sale had, especially at his age. Same with Marcell Ozuna, same with Raisel Iglesias, talking about how rare it is to see Spencer Swellenbach emerge, or a player like a Spencer Swellenbach emerge and have the success that he has, what that means, how big of a development that is for our future. I look forward to talking about that. That's one I'm not going to say it's better than continuing to win in the playoffs, but at least for content purposes for the podcast, it's going to be a bit fun to dive into a bit of the highlights of the season, the positives from the season. Because again, we've got plenty of time to talk about the negatives, which we've talked about extensively throughout the season. It's going to be fun to be able to spotlight some of the more positive things about the season and then get into really how the Braves can improve their chances to make the most of what's going to be a critical 2025 season. My name's Shawn Coleman. You can find me I almost gave Steven's Twitter name. You can find me at StatsSAC on Twitter/X. You can find Steven at B_outliers on Twitter/X. Hammer territory across all forms of social media. We are very proud to be part of the family of podcasts with Foul Territory. Always great content from them and the several team podcasts that they have. Check every one of them out. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. That's where we'll be for free, also on YouTube. Until next time, I know that the season is over, but the off season is beginning, and with this Braves squad, that means another pursuit of a World Series title in 2025 is officially begun. Until next time, go Braves. We'll talk to you again soon here on the Hammer Territory Podcast.